year.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that glare.
No problem.
This is such a great idea.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad you're enjoying it. We've also got some people that are chatting in. And at any point, if you have questions or comments, you can put them right into that chat window there. So I've noticed people kind of tend to tune in a few minutes late. So I'm going to wait just another minute here. In the meantime, if anyone did want to show support, I put those links in the chat. And then also a couple little plugs. I am drinking Virtue Rosé cider. It is, no, actually today it's Brut. It's Brut cider. It's very dry and very delicious. And then my dress is one of my favorite Chicago companies. It's called Mata Traders. I don't know how much you can see it, but there's the dress. I'm going to put in the name of the company. They are amazing. They make all cotton dresses, and they're located in Chicago, but it's all fair trade. It's like my entire summer wardrobe as we're starting to go into summer. But they're not paying me or anything like that. I'm just wanting to show support for them. We're waiting for other people to tune in. So I think we will start. So thank you all for coming to our Chicago history crash course in 20 minutes. I am going to cram into 20 minutes more than 100 years of history. And if at any points you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. In my efforts of making it be 20 minutes, I might not be able to get to all of the questions. So I am Amanda. I created a tour company. It's called Chicago Detours. We are 10 years old. We're a small business. We're a team of 7 employees and tour guides. And we do walking tours. We do bus tours. And I'm going to mute you all too, just FYI. So we do all kinds of fun things around the city of Chicago. And right now we are, of course, doing all these online experiences. So weekdays at 6 p.m. are our historic happy hour for curious people. And those are 20-minute talks. And then on the weekends are virtual tours. What I mean by virtual tour is that a live tour guide will be explaining architecture and history to you. So what we did this past weekend, we had different tour guides with Chicago Detours actually showing different building types in different neighborhoods live with our camera phones. And then I also did a tour via Google Street View, and it worked out awesome. So we're really excited to do those this weekend. And real quick, I'm going to experiment with this polling. I just am launching a poll. And what it is, I'm curious about what you're interested in for our future events. So if we do another crash course, what topic might you be most interested in? And for a live virtual tour, what topics or areas are you interested in? So thank you so much for your input on that. And we will get started here. So I'm still getting used to this world of Zoom. And so give me one quick moment here. I don't want to do that. I am going to share my screen, and you are going to be able to see all of my wonderful images for our history crash course. So view full screen. All right, so let us begin, except let's begin at the beginning. How about that? Oops, sorry about that. I am more into analog ways of communicating. So here you go, Chicago Detours. I gave you our spiel. I am going to set my timer so that I am sensitive to all the closet reorganizing that everyone needs to get done these days, right? All right, so real quick, I want to just do a timeline, because when we talk about history, it starts to get real boring if it just becomes a bunch of dates and names. So I just want to give some bigger overarching ideas of the periods of time that we're looking at in Chicago history. So we've got earliest history, then you have the founding of the city in the early 1800s with Fort Dearborn, federal fort when Chicago was the westernmost point of the United States. 1837, it's officially a city. 1850s is going to be the development of the railroads. Then you've got, after that, the real roots of industry come from that. 1871 fire is this sort of pivotal point, really building into the growth of the city and more immigration. And then you see this blossoming of consumerism around the turn of the century. So we're going to kind of think around these eras. And then you have 1920s, AKA Roaring 20s, Jazz era. Then you have the 1930s and the Great Depression and the beginning of the decline, literally, of the population of the city, people moving out to the suburbs really en masse from the 1940s to the 1980s. You also have the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And then you have this return to the city in the 1990s, and then you come into the present time. So the Chicago flag is a good way to get a core understanding of the history, because the 4 stars are 4 major events in Chicago history. That first one is going to be the founding with the Fort Dearborn. But before that, we're talking early 1800s for that. In the late 1600s, these explorers, Joliet and Marquette, came close to this area, and they came by canoe, and there was an idea with all these waterways that maybe someday this could be a good place for a city. Now, many Native Americans have come through this area, but by the 1700s, it was going to be predominantly Potawatomis, and this is their kind of residential architecture. The first permanent resident is Jean-Baptiste Dusab. He was part Haitian, part French-Canadian, and he had his house right about where the Michigan Avenue Bridge is today. And he was involved in fur trading too, the roots of the commerce. So in the early 1800s is going to be when Federal Fort Dearborn was built. We actually start our, we have a tour called Architectural Crash Course Tour, walking tour. And it starts right here, and we really get into like what this architecture was like. And right there at the Michigan Avenue Bridge, if you're walking and you look at the sidewalk, you will see these plaques, and they're actually delineating where they believe Fort Dearborn was, because it was right at that location. Now, going into the mid-1800s, the city expands. So it really starts right there at the Chicago River. What we know of now is the core of downtown. And you'll see that on the right side of the map. And then the other pieces are being annexed to the city. This is just in the mid-1800s. It's going to be by late 1800s that most of what we know of as Chicago has been annexed. So early Chicago is all built around the river. Here you can see, this is going to be from the Rush Street Bridge, which is would have existed right next to today's Michigan Avenue Bridge. All the industry here along the water. And that accounted for, of course, eventually we end up having all these movable bridges over our rivers, such a symbol of the city. Now, they call this the second wave of European immigrants in the mid-1800s. It's predominantly German and Irish, so they're going to be the first people of Chicago. And then the waterways get eclipsed by railroads, and the railroads are built in the mid-1800s and really creating, establishing Chicago as a nexus for transportation, basically connecting all the natural resources that you have around the Midwest. I'm talking minerals, metals, lumber, animals. All these little rail lines would come into Chicago from around the Midwest up in, Wisconsin and westward. And then in Chicago, the factories would make them into new products and then ship them off to the populations, which of course at that time, the majority of the United States was more East Coast and South. So then you have actually the first American suburb ever is right off the border of Chicago, and it all is because of the railroads. We often think of suburbs as being connected by highways, but the first ones were train suburbs. You can see this very direct line cutting through the image, and that is going to be the railroad that connected Riverside with downtown. Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So in the bottom left-hand corner of the image is going to be where it started. And then it was windy, it had been dry, and hey, the city was built mostly of wood, and the fire spread in the directions you see there. This is rubble that was left after the Great Chicago Fire of downtown. The thing is, when people talk about the Great Fire, they often talk about all the things that were lost. But I like to talk about what wasn't lost. What wasn't lost was 2/3 of the city. And 2/3 of the city contained workers and factories, and there was business, and there was money to be made. So the city, this is the water tower. It's come to be a symbol for the city survival from the Great Chicago Fire, because it actually did not burn down in that. It was built just a few years before the fire. But you can see there was nothing really left here. And then the city rebuilds with a bang. There are all these industrialists like Cyrus McCormick, who were getting real savvy with making new inventions, new products. He, of course, made a ton of money off of a reaper. And how would you get some poor farmer out in the middle of nowhere to want to be able to buy your crazy new invention? Money back guarantee. And he managed to be very successful with this. And then, of course, this is how today you've got McCormick all over various buildings in Chicago. Now, this is an image from later, but I'd like to just point out that in the 1800s there, in the roots of the city was the plan for beaches and parks, giant parks to be connected by boulevards. Here you see a total nightmare for social distancing. This was going to be summertime at the beach. And I mean, imagine people didn't have air conditioning. Parks were really a way to get out of your home, to be able to do something other than work, for which Chicago, of course, was so much known as a city that worked because of all the industry. So the industrialization is really happening post Chicago Fire. It is absolutely rebuilding with a bang. And you have lots of food processing. You have the great operations of the Chicago stockyards, which I've done tours with people from across the world who learned about the Chicago stockyards like in middle school, because it was one of the first real industrial complexes that ever existed. Here you've got like Vienna beef hot dogs. Oscar Mayer actually came from Chicago. So much food processing. There was also steel manufacturing was absolutely huge. You had the U.S. Steel Works on the south side of Chicago, and all this steel was building other factories, railroads, bridges, our buildings, everything. Now, there were some people that were making insane amounts of money during this time of the late 1800s. It's going to be before the federal income tax. There's going to be railroad tycoons and bankers and everything. They make these, they had these lavish mansions. So this is called the Gilded Age of America, this late 1800s time. And some of these, of course, still exist today, primarily like the Gold Coast of Chicago. But then on the flip side, you have most people were being exploited. There were very, very poor European immigrants coming in then, and they were doing backbreaking labor. If you would like to learn more about the Haymarket riot and what that impacted, you can either watch my talk from last Thursday on YouTube or come on our Factories to Calories Fulton Market food tour. Let's move on though, getting into our 20 minutes time span. Retail was huge in Chicago. This is actually, this building still exists today, right in the middle of downtown. It's Macy's, but Marshall Field was getting the greatest products from across the world, really, and revolutionizing shopping. And all the retail was here because they could make their products in the factories and then ship them off to smaller towns very easily. Of course, then Sears ended up building this giant Sears Tower. And then from the retail, you had incredible advancements in advertising, such as with like Leo Burnett creating Tony the Tiger. Printing and publishing were absolutely huge. Of course, that was the primary way of disseminating information. And you have on the left here is going to be Donnelly, R.R. Donnelly Printing. They are one of the oldest printing companies in Chicago and one of the largest in the world today. They've moved a bit more to digital, but this building still exists right next to McCormick Place. And then on the right is going to be Ebony. Ebony and Jet magazines from the 40s into just a few years ago was a Chicago company. And all of the printing of Chicago is a huge industry. But that's moving into the entire of printing. Let's go back to our timeline. Arguably the first skyscraper is the Home Insurance Building, 1884. Downtown builds up. It gets all dense and is going vertically, literally building up. And you have buildings like the Chicago Public Library from the late 1800s. And you have the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition on the south side of Chicago, near where today's University of Chicago campus is. You've got where you had all of these buildings were exhibit halls, okay? Showing all kinds of different new technologies like the popcorn making machine. Or how about, this image is so crazy. This is a moving sidewalk. This was the first moving sidewalk, bringing people from boats on Lake Michigan into the fairgrounds. And we have an 1893 World's Fair tour that's really a great time, because most of what actually exists from the fair is in downtown Chicago. At the turn of the century and with that World's Fair were the first elevated tracks that were built to take fairgoers from downtown to the fair. Now, there are many architects of Chicago, but Daniel Burnham is going to be one who made gorgeous early skyscrapers in downtown. And most of all, he was an early American urban planner. He wanted Chicago to look like this. It didn't happen though. But he wanted these radial streets, and here you can get a sense of what an even more developed park system and boulevard system would be with all the green that you see here. You also have the development with the car of the different layers of downtown Chicago, where they do like Batman film chase scenes. And then you've got, this is the Daniel Burnham building, which is the first skyscrapers were called the Chicago School, also called the Commercial Style. Then you've got like gorgeous department store buildings down on State Street too, like this one. Frank Lloyd Wright will be doing a crash course on architecture later this week, so you'll be able to learn more about him. And then we get all these great writers in Chicago too. Third wave of European immigration. We start to get more Greek, Italian, Eastern European, like predominantly Lithuanian, Polish. Forgive me if I forgot any groups. I'm trying to go quick. And lots of various Jewish Europeans as well. Navy Pier is built in the 1920s. It is a pier for the people. It is for freight traffic, for ferry boats that cross Lake Michigan. Great Migration is going to be mostly 19 teens into the 1970s, two big waves within that. That is, of course, going to be the movement of blacks from the south to the north. There's an incredible demand for labor in all of these factories, and a much better life that could be afforded here than sharecropping in the south. And of course, then you also end up getting the jazz era. Louis Armstrong spent his time, much of his time in Chicago, and Prohibition. You had giant breweries like this that either made their beer on the sly or made it low alcohol. And Al Capone and the whole gangsters and everything. I'm not so much into violence. I'm kind of a hippie at heart, you know, so I don't get too much into the shoot 'em up part of things, but the illicit activities part can be kind of fun. There were so many, gambling was huge in Chicago, and not just during Prohibition. All kinds of different gambling halls and ways that they had lookouts to make sure they didn't get caught. In the 20s, you've got that Art Deco style, really blocky. This was the field building that we talked about on our Architecture of Money and Power tour on Saturday. Or how about the Carbon and Carbide building with its 24 karat gold top? You've got all kinds of poets too and other writers. In the 1920s, Chicago was really flourishing for writing. Mies van der Rohe brings the modernist style to Chicago with these big black boxy buildings. And then the construction of the highways changes everything. Chicago was a railroad town. The highways meant that the factories could move out of the city where the rent was cheaper, and the highways ripped through entire neighborhoods to even build them. And it further accelerated people leaving Chicago and moving out to the suburbs. Also, with the building of the highways was the construction of giant federal housing projects that originally had great intention, but through the years of greed and mishandling of funds by political corruption and all of that, they fell into disrepair. You have a big wave of Mexican immigration beginning in the 1960s, for why now today Chicago has the second largest population of Mexicans outside Mexico. Mayor Daley, one of the most powerful mayors in all of American history. You've got Chicago blues in the 1960s. What that means is there's an electric guitar and a drum set, and musicians like Etta James, Muddy Waters at Blues Heaven Foundation is the building that used to be Chess Records. You've got construction of these incredible structures in the 60s, like Bertrand Goldberg's Marina City. You've got Chase Tower. You got the development with the highway of the University of Illinois at Chicago. And then you have the civil unrest with MLK assassination riots, Democratic Convention riots. Then you have the Chicago Stockyards closes in the early 1970s as an absolute symbol of the downfall of Chicago's industry. Then you go into 1990, the redevelopment of what had originally been Municipal Pier becomes an amusement park for tourism, ushering in a new wave of tourism into Chicago. And then you have the period of urban renewal beginning in the 1990s. This is going to be with young people moving in to neighborhoods like Wicker Park and beginning the wheels of gentrification. And then you go into the postmodern times. There's a ton of development in the 90s and early 2000s of universities in downtown Chicago, bringing young people down to the city. And then you have Millennium Park opening up in 2004, further accelerating this sort of growth of tourism in the city and Chicago's image worldwide. And now today you have giant high rises and people moving into downtown Chicago, an absolute reversal of that exodus from the suburbs. So who knows what the future may bring, especially as we have our current situation where we are not even using the spaces that we normally would. I would like to, before I open up our Q&A, I have a couple things I would like to share with you. So we have, if you want to connect with us on social media, if you go to our homepage, scroll down to the bottom, it's all there: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube channel, Instagram. We're really pumping up our YouTube channel, we're recording all of these, putting the content on there. Instagram, we've got all kinds of really good stuff. And then this is our Chicago Architecture Crash Course walking tour. I mentioned the Fulton Factories to Calories Fulton Market food tour. And we also have a new South Loop tour where we go by our Donnelly building and Gilded Age mansions. And it's like an incredible comprehensive history of Chicago in that tour. And then if you love learning about Chicago, we have a ton of stuff on our blog about architecture, history, you know, sipping hot chocolate in historic spots, all kinds of fun things there. So I am going to see what kinds of questions there might be. I did it. I managed to do it in 20 minutes. By the way, yes, thank you. Thank you. It was, I could have done it in, you know, maybe 5 hours with the amount that I had there. But real quick, if anyone needs the links, as far as giving is concerned, it is so appreciated. We're a small business just trying to make this work, but I understand too, a lot of people right now are not in a position to give, and I want you to keep learning. So that's why we're offering these at no charge. Really what means a ton is if you can just tell a friend about Chicago Detours, come again, invite a friend. You can share, tag them on our Instagram or Facebook or whatever. That just means a ton. And then of course to someday come on a tour with us. I will paste in here the links that I previously did as far as if you wanted to give. So questions, Q&A is open. And I think if anybody else wanted to answer the poll, that is still open too. So Mexican immigration in the city in the 1960s was partly, one is that there had been very strict quotas to European immigration. So that pretty much curbed off in the 1930s, the European immigration. And then there was some sort of loosening of the borders in the 1960s, but there was still an incredible demand for labor. And when you look at Chicago's immigration history, it is often fueled by the constant hunt for laborers. You know, that's where we have a huge amount of Polish as well. They were, you know, the poorest country in Western Europe. So Kimberly, yes, I can't wait for in-person tours too, but I am having a lot of fun with this. I know there's a question about Printers Row. Yeah, there's on our Neighborhoods and Cultural Diversity bus tour that we do for private groups. We go down Printers Row actually and look at some of the really cool architecture there. When and how were Chicago's borders formed? So Chicago was constantly annexing, mostly from like the mid 1800s to the late 1800s. And they did it piecemeal. So for example, when the 1893 World's Fair happened, that's pretty much when Hyde Park got annexed into the city. And then of course, like when O'Hare Airport was built, that suddenly, you know, Chicago reached its arm out to get that. Yes, some of our tours include food and drink. Whenever we incorporate food and drink, it's part of the experience and it's part of the storytelling. Bob, thank you for your kind words. Let's see, Krista. So the South Loop is really quite an interesting story, and you definitely should come on that tour that we're launching in the spring. The short explanation is that the South Loop was very industrial, and then it was kind of flipped over on its head in the early 80s and turned into this residential neighborhood that it is today. I also did not mention tomorrow we're doing Badass Women of Chicago History. It's an awesome one to invite your daughter, your mom, your sister to. We actually, for this one and tomorrow, we were at such capacity, I had to expand our terms with Zoom. And that's going to be a really fun one. We've got one on Chicago parks, Chicago sports history. And then based on your feedback, we'll see what we do for the tours this weekend. Those are going to be at 1 p.m. Tours about poets and writers of Chicago. That could be really cool. There's like on our Wicker Park tour, we go by Nelson Algren's home. We used to go by Nelson Algren's home, but there's lots of really good stuff there. So thank you everyone for, what's my favorite detour to go on? Maybe you're asking that to the group, because mine is always whatever one I'm doing. They're all like my little babies and I love them all equally, all of our tours. So those of you that came, I really appreciate you spending some virtual moments with me and Chicago Detours. Tomorrow you'll get a chance to see tour guide Marie. And then the architecture crash course will be by tour guide Alex, because Chicago Detours is much more than me. Ultimately, I'm here for another couple of minutes. If anyone else has questions, please spread the word and make this even more exciting than it already is. It's super, super appreciated. So thank you.